Can't believe they got me in here painting toys. I suppose there's less of a risk of me being shot, stabbed, arrested. No bounty on my head. Used to get up to so much more. Wheeling and dealing, in and out of the trade ports like I was never there. Got nowhere to go in here, no one to banter with. I miss the boys. Oh, Freddy, with his incessant moaning actually. He was quite a moan. E8 with his, oh god, lubricate his servo arms at lunch. It was actually pretty gross. Put me off my sandwiches. None of those guys have called me while I've been sentenced. I'm sure they're busy, lots to do, people to scam. Well, best paint some toys. In this episode of Half Crafted, I want to talk about painting your models how you want to paint them. And along the way, we'll be painting up these Necrons from my first video. I'm aiming for a GRIMDARK style with these models, so we're going to start with a dry brush over the model as a base coat. Advantages of using the dry brush to base coat the model is you're going to be highlighting the raised surfaces and leaving all the recesses the dark black that we use to prime the model. Admittedly, this isn't the driest of dry brushes. I'm using it for a base coat, so I want it to be applied a little bit thicker. I suppose it's more of a moist brush. Don't worry if there's any overbrushing onto the gun, as this could be edge highlights further down the line and it will be painted over it. Always important to deploy anti-spill measures when dealing with washes or contrast. Speaking of washes, we're going to be using Nuln Oil to darken down those recesses even more all over this model. So what do I mean by painting your models the way you want to paint them? Well, what I'm getting at is that you should paint your models to the point where you are happy. You're going to be the person playing with these models, you're going to be the person looking at these models the most, so paint for your own satisfaction. As you wash, keep an eye out for any of it pooling on flat surfaces. This might look good at the moment, but when it dries it will leave a stain. Now that that wash has dried, you can really see it's darkened down the surface of that lead belcher. And what we want to do is just pick out some key areas that are the highest, brightest points of the model to highlight. You could do this with a dry brush as well, but I'd recommend making sure there's very little paint on the brush. I'm using a regular paintbrush and highlighting because I need to practice my edge highlights. There's a lot of awfully high standards these days online for how models should be painted. Everyone is constantly on Reddit, Instagram, looking at incredibly well painted models. Consider when you're painting your models, what are you painting them for? Do you have an army you want to put together quickly? Are you working on one model to be the best it can be? I'm trying to get these Immortals finished because they've been on my desk for far too long. I'm giving them a bit of flair here on the shoulder pads with an Achillean green contrast. This isn't a particular Necron colour scheme, I just want my more elite troop units to stand out from the warriors. As if Nuln Oil all over a black prime wasn't enough, we're going to be creating a glaze here with Black Templar contrast paint. I'm mixing in quite a bit of water, you can see the consistency there. And we're going to use this to darken down the more skeletal parts of the model. Because this is a contrast paint, it is translucent, so a lot of that silver highlight underneath will still show. There's a lot of areas you could choose on the model to place this contrast. It's important to think what points are most worth putting the time into. Some parts are going to be hidden and never seen, and that doesn't mean they shouldn't have any paint on them, but it does mean that you maybe shouldn't think too hard on them. Good thing about having a contrast paint like this watered down, if you get it on any parts of the model you don't want it, if you're quick you can just rub it off with a finger. I know we're now painting black on black, but we don't want that spray prime to be the base layer. The contrast will have a much smoother finish, so put this all over the guns. Picking out some details now. I'm using Runelord brass, but you could use brassy brass from Vallejo, which sounds very brassy indeed. I'm picking out the casing around the edge of the gun to give it a more layered look, like it's got a central part and outer parts. And while you got the brass out, don't forget to highlight the anks on the Necron's chest. Same principle for the Tesla weapons, but obviously a different pattern. This was quite satisfying actually, maybe because there was just one of the Tesla weapons, but it was fun having the variation between models. Keeps it interesting. Now to add some depth to this brass that we've put on the guns, I'm watering down the Black Templar even more, dabbing the thick paintbrush on some kitchen towel to remove most of the paint, and then I'm stippling on the side of the guns here to give a sort of mottled appearance. We're just having a bit of a play around here, but what I was aiming for was giving the shiny metallic surface a bit more depth, a bit more interest in these weapons than just shiny. And once that's dried, I've gone in with a Reikland Flesh Shade wash over the top of all of that brass. This brings it down a bit and also introduces a bit more of a red hue to the metallic. There is a lot of room to play around with metallics and washes, I think mainly because they are paints made to make your life simpler. Corn red now, big up me corn red, love corn red. I don't know why there are certain paints that I like more, maybe it's nostalgia, but I find that corn red dries in a very satisfying way. It goes on quite bright, but once it dries it's more of a deep scarlet and it's very matte. And we're using this to cover all the cables. Some of these cables can be quite tricky and awkward to get to, and that is why I won't be highlighting them. Back to the lead belcher again, and I'm using this thick brush once more with very little paint on the end to just introduce some more scratchy metallic looks to the end of our gun that we've left Black Templar. With such little paint on the brush, it's pretty hard to mess this up on a model that is mostly metallics, so have a play around. Onto the energy glows now, and for this we're going to need a good white paint to lay down the foundations for our brighter colours. I'm using AK Interactive White from their Intense range because I've tried a lot of Citadel white paints and they just haven't done it for me. Don't forget to also fill in the eyes while you're on this step. This isn't sped up 600%, I'm actually incredibly fast at painting, but only with white paint. It's a blessing and a curse. If you're thinning your paints correctly and you get a little bit of paint somewhere else on the model as you're picking out details, if you wet your brush quickly, the moisture left on the brush you can use to wash away the pigment left on the model from the area you don't want it. Or alternatively, as I mentioned before, you can just use a finger to wipe away the excess. I think basing with the correct colour for the colour you intend to put over it is probably one of the most worthwhile steps you can do when painting miniatures, because you save yourself a lot of work in the long run and the effects really do pay off. For example, if I don't put this white down, when it comes time to put a layer over it to glow brightly, like this magenta right on cue, it will take many more coats to get a bright colour. I've used this colour scheme for all of my Necron units, which is quite a lot now, and while the magenta paint is not the best, it doesn't have the best coverage, it doesn't thin down the best, paired with a good white paint underneath it, it really shows. It's really satisfying working your way around the model at this stage, filling in the white areas with the colour that you want. Seeing the eyes glow and the energy glow, it really brings the model to life and it starts to look complete. And when you're working on a model and it does start to look complete, it's a big motivator to get the models finished. And your definition of a complete model might be different to mine. I think that's why terms like tabletop ready are misleading. And so we move on to the bases. I'm using some cheap umber acrylic here to just go over the basing material that we put down in my first video. If you haven't seen that, go check it out. I'm not too concerned about the colour of this, although it does dry a lot darker. I picked out some details using Agrax Earthshade as well. I wanted this pipe to be a little bit darker, a little bit more rusted looking, and the wood plank that this Necron's standing on needed to be more woody. Next, some off-white to pick out the skulls on one of our bases. I'm using Screaming Skull. When this dried, this also got a coat of Agrax Earthshade. We're just working our way around the model, picking out any details. For this wall, I'm using any leftover Screaming Skull I had mixed with pure black from Vallejo to make a dark grey to use to pick out any stones. Again, little bits of detail but with minimal effort here.
Introducing to the stage Mr. T and G Flocka, formerly known as Kermit the Flock.
Sorry, gotta stretch those DJ skills every now and then or you lose them. In case you missed that, we're putting some watered down PVA on these bases with a large brush. Try and get it wherever you want the flock to stick to. If you want a bit more precision, maybe just do this in steps, go in with a smaller brush for more precise areas. I'm also adding some dried moss bits superglued in different areas, again just to mix things up a little bit. Gives it more of a woodsy look. While the PVA is still wet, shuffle any about that you want to be in more specific areas and remove any from the rim of the base. Next up, I've got some isopropyl alcohol here mixed with a tiny bit of water. This gets applied to the base before the PVA goes on again. That way, the capillary action of the isopropyl alcohol will pull all the watered down PVA into every little corner, so that when it sets, you get a nice solid base and you don't get any of your nice flock coming off. Oh, that reminds me. Make sure the PVA is drying before you're applying the isopropyl alcohol and watered down PVA. Tufts! Sorry about that, involuntary outburst. We do love a tuft here at Halfcrafted. Apply a little bit of super glue underneath each one and then plonk them on the base where you want them to go. Gently press them into position. The basing material combined with the flock, combined with these tufts, really helps to add an extra dimension to the bases. Lastly, we've got decals. I recommend getting a small round flat surface, and you're going to need micro set and micro sol. Cut out your selected decal, and then you're going to want to put a little bit of water on the flat surface and drop it in. Apply micro set firstly to the area that you want to apply the decal to. Carefully pry off the decal. I found it's best to use a small brush for this, because the hairs are so small they neatly get underneath. And once you've decided where you want your decal and correctly positioned it, just leave it for a few minutes to set. Finally, with a very fine amount of micro sol, brush over the decal to soften it. This will allow it to conform better to the surface it's on. All there is to do then is remove the mini from any holder it's in and paint the rim. Black is the only choice. I lied. Don't paint your minis how you want to. Paint them how I want to. Black is the only colour available. Thanks for watching, and I hope you've learned some easy tips to paint up your minis the way you want to. Please like and subscribe for new videos coming soon.